In the rugged, cloud-piercing peaks of the Elburz Mountains, located in what is now northern Iran, there once sat a fortress that the world believed to be impregnable. For nearly 2 centuries, this citadel, known as Alamut, served as the beating heart of a shadow empire. It was the sanctuary of a radical sect that projected power not through vast armies, open field battles, but through the precise, terrifying application of the dagger. They were the Nizari Ismailis, known to their enemies in the West as the assassins. Kings, caliphs, and crusader princes trembled at the mere mention of their name. They had cultivated a reputation so fearsome that a single threat, a single knife left on a pillow next to a sleeping monarch, was enough to change the course of politics in the Middle East. They believed themselves untouchable, safe in their eagle's nest, high above the chaotic squabbles of the empires below. They were the masters of death, the architects of political terror. But in the middle of the 13th century, the master of death found themselves staring into the eyes of the apocalypse. From the steppes of the East came a force that did not fear the dagger in the dark. This new power did not negotiate. It did not succumb to psychological warfare, and it did not care about the impregnability of mountain fortresses. They were the Mongols, and when these two forces collided, the immovable object of the assassin order and the irresistible force of the Mongol war machine, it resulted in one of the most brutal, decisive, and historically significant confrontations the world has ever seen. This is the story of how the most dreaded killers in history were hunted down and dismantled by the most devastating army the world had ever known. To understand the magnitude of this clash, we must first ascend the treacherous paths to the fortress of Alamut and understand the people who inhabited it. The Nizari Ismailis were a schism within the Shia branch of Islam, a minority within a minority, facing persecution from the powerful Sunni Seljuk Empire that surrounded them. In the late 11th century, under the charismatic and brilliant leadership of Hassan I Sabbah, they adopted a strategy of survival that would become legendary. Hassan knew he could not defeat the Seljuk armies in open battle. He did not have the numbers, the gold, or the cavalry. So, he chose a different path. He chose asymmetrical warfare. Hassan seized the fortress of Alamut in 1090, not by siege, but by conversion and infiltration. Once established on the rock, he began to build a network of mountain strongholds across Persia and Syria. These castles were marvels of military engineering, perched on sheer cliffs, self-sustaining with intricate water cisterns and vast food stores, capable of withstanding sieges that could last for years. But walls alone were not enough. To project power, Hassan developed the core of the Fidai. These were young men, deeply indoctrinated in the esoteric teachings of the faith, who were willing to sacrifice their lives to eliminate the enemies of the sect. The legends surrounding these men are vast and often exaggerated by their enemies, particularly the tales brought back to Europe by Marco Polo regarding drug-fueled gardens of paradise used to trick recruits. While the historical reality was likely more grounded in intense religious devotion and martial discipline than hashish-induced hallucinations, the effect was undeniably terrifying. A Fidai would spend years learning the language and customs of his target. He would infiltrate a royal court, perhaps serving as a groom or a guard for months, waiting for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, usually in a public place like a mosque or a crowded market, he would strike. The goal was not escape. The goal was the public execution of the target and the subsequent martyrdom of the assassin. This created a terrifying equation for the rulers of the time. No amount of guards could save you if the killer was willing to die to reach you. For over 150 years, this strategy worked. The assassins assassinated 2 caliphs, many viziers, and even crusader kings like Conrad of Montferrat. The great Sultan Saladin himself survived 2 attempts on his life and eventually chose a truce rather than risk a third. The Order of Assassins became a third power in the region, balancing between the Crusader and the Muslim sultans, extracting tribute and respect through the currency of fear. They were the vipers in the nest of the Middle East, and no one could root them out. However, far to the northeast, on the wind-swept grasslands of Mongolia, a different kind of power had risen. Under Genghis Khan, the scattered tribes of the steppe had been forged into a unified nation with a singular purpose, the conquest of the world. The Mongol army was not a horde of undisciplined barbarians, as they were often depicted by their terrified victims. They were a highly disciplined, meritocratic military machine. They possessed the fastest cavalry in history, capable of covering vast distances with terrifying speed. They were masters of logistics, coordination, and, crucially, siege engineering. Unlike the nomadic armies of the past, the Mongols adapted. When they encountered walled cities in China and Central Asia, they didn't turn back. They hired Chinese engineers, built trebuchets, and learned how to crumble stone, By the 1250s, Genghis Khan was dead, and the empire was ruled by his grandson, Möngke Khan. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, but there was still work to be done. The Middle East remained a patchwork of powers that had not yet fully submitted to Mongol authority. To address this, Möngke Khan turned to his brother, another grandson of Genghis, a man named Hulagu. Hulagu Khan was given a massive army, one of the largest the Mongols had ever assembled for a Western campaign. His mandate was clear and brutal. He was to march into Persia and the Middle East and bring the entire region under the yoke of the Mongol Empire. His instructions contained a specific hierarchy of targets. First, he was to eliminate the Lurs, a rebellious people in the mountains. Second, he was to destroy the Nizari Ismaili state, the assassins, and dismantle their castles. Only once the assassins were eradicated was he to move on to his third and most famous target, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The fact that the assassins were prioritized above the Caliph of Baghdad speaks volumes about how the Mongols viewed them. To the Mongol mindset, the assassin state was an abomination. The Mongols respected strength, open warfare, and loyalty. The Ismaili method of killing, striking from the shadows, killing leader without a declaration of war, was viewed as dishonorable and chaotic. Furthermore, the assassins represented a challenge to the Mongol concept of universal rule. There could be no sovereign territory within the Mongol sphere that did not submit. But there was also a personal element. There were rumors, substantiated by Mongol intelligence, that the assassins had dispatched 400 fidai to the Mongol capital of Karakorum with orders to assassinate Möngke Khan. Whether this plot was real or merely a convenient casus belli, it sealed the fate of the order. The Mongols did not tolerate threats to their Khans. In 1253, the vanguard of the Mongol army began to move. It was a slow, inexorable tide. Unlike a lightning raid, this was a migration of destruction. Hulagu moved deliberately, securing supply lines, clearing roads, and bringing with him a massive corps of engineers. He was bringing the industrial capacity of the East to crush the mountains of the West. The assassins, at this time, were led by Rukn al-Din Kursha. He was a young man, lacking the fanatical resolve and strategic brilliance of his predecessors like Hassan as-Sabah. As the Mongol army approached, the psychological pressure began to mount. The assassins were used to enemies they could frighten. They were used to armies that would lay siege for a season and then retreat when the winter snows came. But the Mongols were different. They did not leave. The first clashes occurred in the outlying fortresses. The Mongols surrounded the Ismaili strongholds in the Quistan region. These were castles built on pinnacles of rock, designed to be unreachable. But the Mongols brought with them a new terror, the heavy trebuchet. These were not the small catapults of the local armies. These were massive, counterweight engines capable of hurling 300-pound stones with devastating accuracy. The Mongol engineers, often Chinese experts drafted into service, would construct these machines on neighboring peaks, sometimes building artificial platforms to gain the necessary elevation. The siege of the fortress of Gerdka is a prime example of Mongol tenacity. It was one of the strongest Ismaili positions. The Mongols surrounded it, built a circumvallation wall to starve it out, and battered it with stones. Gerdku would actually hold out for years, long after the rest of the order had fallen, a testament to Ismaili engineering. But it was an isolated island in a Mongol sea. The rest of the state was crumbling, as Hulagu's main force advanced deeper into the Elburz Mountains in 1256. The assassin leader, Rukn al-Din, tried to play the diplomatic game that had saved his order so many times before. He sent emissaries to Hulagu, offering partial submission. He offered to tear down some of his battlements, to pay tribute, to pray for the Khan. He tried to buy time, hoping the Mongols would be satisfied with a token gesture and move on to Baghdad. Hulagu played along, but only to a point. He accepted the emissaries, treated them well, and kept the negotiation open, all while his army continued to march closer and Ciel Ozer to Alamut. It was a masterclass in psychological domination. Hulagu demanded that Rukn al-Din present himself in person. The Grand Master of the assassins prevaricated, sending his brother instead, then his son. He was terrified of leaving the safety of Alamut, yet he knew that staying there was becoming a death sentence. The Mongols were now methodically reducing the castles around Alamut. They were dismantling the assassin infrastructure piece by piece. The fear that the assassins had projected for centuries was now being turned back upon them. The fidai, so deadly in the crowded streets of a city, were useless again. 100,000 Mongol cavalrymen sweeping through the valleys. You cannot assassinate a swarm of locusts. The Mongol security apparatus was also incredibly tight. They were vigilant against infiltration, and the distinct appearance of the Mongols made it difficult for Ismaili agents to blend. in as they had done with Arabs and Persians. Finally, in late 1256, the noose tightened. Hulagu's forces arrived at the foot of Alamut. The eagle's nest, the symbol of Ismaili invincibility, was surrounded. The sight must have been awe-inspiring and terrifying. The fortress sat atop a narrow ridge, protected by steep precipices on all sides. But down in the valley, the Mongol army covered the earth. The sound of their drums, the smoke from their fires, and the sight of their engineers assembling. The great siege engines signaled the end of an era. Rukn al-Din. Nakursha's will broke. He realized that fighting was futile. The Mongols were not going to storm the walls and lose men unnecessarily. They were going to pulverize the mountain until there was nothing left. On November 19, 1256, the unthinkable happened. The Grand Master of the Assassins descended from his fortress and surrendered to Hulagu Khan. The surrender of Rukn al-Din signaled the collapse of the entire Ismaili state. Hulagu treated the captured leader with a calculated hospitality. He used Rukn al-Din as a pawn, forcing him to travel to the other Ismaili castle, Lamasar, Maymundiz, and others, and order their commanders to surrender. Most obeyed their imam. The gates were opened, and the Mongols poured in. What followed was the systematic dismantling of the assassin network. This was not just a conquest, it was a demolition. Hulagu had orders to destroy the castles, so that they could never again be used as nests for rebellion. The great fortifications, built over decades with immense labor, were torn down. Towers were toppled into the ravines. Walls were breached and leveled. The most poignant moment of this destruction took place at Alamut itself. The fortress contained a legendary library renowned throughout the Islamic world. It housed centuries of scientific, astronomical, and theological works, as well as the secret archives of the assassin order. Accompanying Hulagu was the Persian historian Adamak Javaini. Javaini was a servant of the Mongols, but as also a scholar. He pleaded with Hulagu to be allowed to examine the library before it was destroyed. Hulagu granted him permission. Javaini rushed into the archives of the doomed fortress. He described finding vast collections of books and sophisticated astronomical instruments. He worked feverishly, selecting the manuscripts he deemed valuable, Koran, scientific treatises, historical records to save them from the fire. However, Javaini was also a Sunni Orthodox scholar who viewed the Ismailis as heretics. Therefore, he made a choice that still pains historians today. He separated the heretical books, the theological tracts of the Ismailis, and the memoirs of their leaders, and condemned them to the flames. The Mongols then torched the library. While Javaini saved much, the internal history of the assassins, told in their own words, was largely lost to smoke and ash, leaving us to view them mostly through the biased lens of their enemies, with the castles dismantled and the library burned. There was only one loose end remaining, the assassins themselves. The Mongols had no intention of allowing the sect to survive as a military force. Once the castles were surrendered, and the utility of Rukn al-Din was exhausted, the slaughter began. Rukn al-Din, the last lord of Alamut, requested an audience with the great Khan Monki in Mongolia to plead his case for mercy. Hulagu allowed him to go, but it was a journey to nowhere. When he arrived in Mongolia, Monki Khan refused to say him, questioning why his head had been sent without the full destruction of his castles being confirmed. Rukn al-Din was turned away. On his journey back to Persia, somewhere on the side of the road in Central Asia, his Mongol escort stopped, drew their swords, and the last Grand Master was kicked to death or put to the sword, depending on the account. Back in Persia, the order went out to liquidate the Ismaili population. It was a massacre. The Mongols gathered the Ismaili garrisons, often under the guise of taking a census, offering them new placements in the army, and then slaughtered them by the thousand. In the Quistan region, it is said that 12,000 Ismailis were killed. The distinct, terrifying power of the assassin state was extinguished in a wash of blood. The deadliest order had been decapitated, their fangs pulled, their nests destroyed. The speed of the collapse was shocking to the contemporary world. For 200 years, the Seljuks and the Crusaders had banged their heads against the walls of Alamut to no avail. The Mongols arrived, and within a single year, the assassin state was history. It demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of the Mongol military machine. They brought a level of total war that the Middle East had simply never experienced. They combined the mobility of a nomadic army with the siege technology of a sedentary empire and the ruthlessness of a force that believed it had a divine mandate to rule the earth. The destruction of the assassins cleared the road for Hulagu's next target. With his rear secure and his communication lines safe from the threat of daggers in the dark, he turned his gaze toward Baghdad. 2 years later, in 1258, The Abbasid Caliphate would suffer a fate even worse than the assassins, marking the end of the Islamic Golden Age. However, the legacy of the clash between the Mongols and the assassins is not just one of destruction. It is a study in the evolution of power. The assassins represented the power of the few against the many, the power of fear, secrecy, and surgical precision. They were the ultimate insurgents. The Mongols represented the power of overwhelming force, of discipline, and of industrial-scale warfare. When these two philosophies clashed, the result was decisive. Precision could not defeat a tsunami. It is important to note that while the assassin state was destroyed, the Nizari Ismaili faith was not. The Mongols could burn castles and kill leaders, but they could not kill an idea. The surviving Ismailis went underground, scattering into the fabric of Persian, Central Asian, and Indian society. They hid their beliefs, practicing taqiyya, precautionary dissimulation, and survived the Mongol storm. Over the centuries, the line of imams continued in secrecy, eventually re-emerging. Today, the Nizari Ismailis are a peaceful and prosperous global community led by the Aga Khan, known for philanthropy and culture rather than daggers and fortresses. But if you travel to the Elburz Mountains today, you can still see the scars of 1256. The ruins of Alamut still cling to the rock, though they are little more than weathered stones and crumbled foundations now. The wind howls through the valleys where the Mongol Tumans once marched. Standing there, looking out over the jagged horizon, one can almost feel the ghost of that cataclysmic year. It was a moment when the world held its breath. The old man of the mountain, a figure of nightmare for kings from London to Cairo, looked out from his high tower and saw the dust rising in the east. He saw the end of his world approaching, not with a stealthy footstep in the night, but with the thunder of a million hooves. The clash between the Mongols and the assassins serves as a brutal reminder of the transitory nature of power. The assassins believed their mountain protected them. The Mongols believed their sky god sanctioned them. In the end, it was not theology or philosophy that decided the day, but the brutal arithmetic of war. The assassins were the deadliest killers of their age, but the Mongols were the executioners of civilization. And when the executioner arrived at the gates of Alamut, the assassins found that their daggers were too short to reach the heart of the storm. The silence that reigns over Alamut today is a heavy one. It is the silence of total defeat, but it is also a monument to a pivotal turning point in history, the year the shadows were burnt away by the fire of the steppe, and the map of the world was redrawn in blood.